Antifa Hamburg G20 versus Seattle WTO 1999. I was there! Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and I have been watching a bunch of videos related to the Antifa riots in Hamburg, Germany at the G20 summit in July of 2017, my favorite video being a long one from Aiden Paladin, who is super fucking smart and has a great channel, and I'll link that video in the description because it details these events much better than I can. Now, there was a small part of me that was getting sick of talking about Antifa, but then I realized that this was probably just due to the fact that Antifa hadn't really been in the news a whole bunch recently. But now they are back, though granted, in Europe. Of course, I'm not in Europe, so I had little to say about this specific event by itself that hasn't already been said. However, one thing I do have as an individual is a rather unique perspective in regards to massive left-wing protests against global capitalism, because I grew up in Seattle and was at the World Trade Organization protests in 1999, aka the Battle of Seattle. So in this video, I will be attempting to explain how and why I think these protests are two very distinctly different beasts. To start with, when we look back at the WTO protests in Seattle, you should keep in mind that Antifa wasn't really an organization, and if they were, their numbers were a very small fraction to what they are now. The next thing to keep in mind is that the founding of the World Trade Organization was one of the benchmarks in global economics, or what many people call globalism, signed into agreement during Bill Clinton's presidency in 1994, making it rather official that the Clintons are probably the biggest name in United States globalism. At the time in the 90s, as I remember very clearly growing up in far leftist Seattle, the mainstream media largely acted like everything was just fine and dandy during the entire Clinton administration. However, there were always far leftists saying that Clinton wasn't really actually very good, and they were protesting and talking about the evils of corporatism. In the 90s, the left was extremely anti-corporate, and as far as I remember, I don't think particularly communist or socialist. They were just opposed to expanding global corporatism because they felt that it would eventually begin fucking over the citizens of our nation. Fancy that. That all said, when the members of the World Trade Organization convened in Seattle in 1999, countless people were handing around paper flyers about the protest, and I even had far leftist teachers at my high school encouraging people to go protest anti-globalism. Oh, how things have changed. However, the mainstream media barely even mentioned that the World Trade Center Organization conference was going on at all at the time, and when the protesters showed up and peacefully locked arms, as soon as the clock struck time for the beginning of the meeting, the protesters were immediately assaulted with pepper spray and rubber bullets. Seriously, basically zero accounts of these protests at this point would ever deny that the police showed anything but excessive force right from the get-go, and it became one of the biggest embarrassments in Seattle history, forcing the police chief to eventually resign. Once attacked violently by the police, the protests ignited into a much bigger deal that lasted about a week, and it was pure chaos. I went by the center a few times and saw with my own eyes people throwing canisters of tear gas from the crowd back at the riot police. It was pretty nuts, and it was only police versus citizens. The citizens were not fighting each other. You see, the police seemed to be under the impression that they could squash the protesters and eventually things would go back to normal, but their blatant violence only encouraged more people to protest, which led to more police and a massively expanding circumference of where the protests actually took place. Eventually, the protests got as far up as Capitol Hill, which is the main hipster bar, restaurant, cafe, shopping, and residential area in Seattle, which is where I worked at an indie movie theater. After the protest had gone on for something like 5 or 6 days, eventually the bewildered and obviously overworked police officers began attacking non-protesting citizens with billy clubs who were doing such things as trying to get inside their apartment buildings as the citizens yelled, "What the fuck, don't hit me, I live here," and it was all caught on film. Now, although the media tried desperately for the first few days to claim that the protesters were violent hooligans, kind of like they are now in Hamburg, the media even went so far as to play footage of some of the few people caught on camera looting places like Starbucks and Nike Town, and they played the footage on a loop to make it look like they kept going in and out of the storefront with more and more goods. When it got to the point when the cops were beating on random people that were just trying to get home, and even I personally got a face full of tear gas after making the mistake of turning the corner after getting off of work at my movie theater. When it all got that crazy, everybody, including the media, had to finally admit what happened in Seattle. The government was oppressing a very large group of its people with violent force because these people were against global corporatism, or happened to be in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time, like I was. So what is the real difference between what is going on in Hamburg, or really just the general antics of Antifa these days, and that particular protest? I mean, Antifa and the Black Bloc protesters are so vehemently opposed to Trump, but can they ever actually articulate why they feel this way? Isn't Trump a nationalist? Didn't he end the Trans-Pacific Partnership? It would almost seem as if, considering the alternative to Trump was Hillary Clinton, who, as I have already explained, is one of the biggest globalists on the entire planet, it would almost seem that Antifa is, in effect, now rioting in favor of global corporatism, though seemingly few of them have any idea that this is the case. So how did we get here? Well, a big thing to keep in mind is that if you have ever had any doubt that the Democratic Party was every bit as much of the big money corporate party as the Republicans were during the Bush administration, you should look into the WikiLeaked Goldman Sachs speeches of Hillary Clinton, where she basically brags to the big banks that she was instrumental in making the Democratic Party the Wall Street Party. But that shouldn't really be anything all that surprising if people actually paid attention. George Bush Sr. was a globalist because he started the first Gulf War for oil. Bill Clinton was a globalist. George W. Bush invaded Iraq again for oil, and Barack Obama kept business running as usual while the Clintons kept their hands in every cookie jar they could, accepting millions of dollars from foreign governments to the Clinton Foundation, hoping to get elected in 2016. So how did we get from the anti-globalist protests of 1999, mostly coming from the left, to having a probable majority of the young masses lashing out at our nationalistic president, many of whom are now Antifa members or at least sympathetic to Antifa, while they simultaneously accidentally endorse corporate globalism in the process by acting like they would have preferred Clinton? Well, I think the change really started with the Occupy protests in 2011, where people opposed to crooked global corporate capitalism that was enabled by government. All these people all across the planet organized by way of social media, which was something that had never happened before, which was the Occupy protests. It was kind of like the battle in Seattle that I talked about earlier, but in every major city in the entire world, and it freaked the crooked global corporatists the fuck out, and they didn't know what to do. However, it would seem that they soon figured it out, and they introduced intersectional feminism into the protests by way of the progressive stack, which you can find footage of on YouTube. Basically, they began telling people that they could speak or not speak depending on how many oppression points any individual had. More so, Antifa showed up and started being obnoxious, and a lot of people believe that this was financed by George Soros himself. And I do believe that there is definitely some evidence for that if you want to look into it on your own time. After the progressive stack and the Black Bloc hooligans showed up, the protests of Occupy dissolved because everybody started fighting amongst themselves like starving piranhas because they never had a tangible goal to begin with, so it just fell apart. And most Occupy protesters knew fuck all about what they were protesting anyway, and even though Obama had bailed out the big banks and his support base theoretically didn't like him all that much because of that, he was reelected in 2012. Why was Obama reelected? Well, despite the massive global protests from the left, ultimately, it was mainly probably because he was black, and because of the undying hatred of Republicans that had been engraved into the heads of so many young Americans. And for good reason. Still, ultimately, if you look into the numbers, it does paint a bit of a picture that Obama won for his second term based on the color of his skin. Because truthfully, as much as I hate to say this as somebody who voted for him twice, it certainly wasn't because he debated well in 2012. After Obama was in office for a second term, the Democratic Party undoubtedly looked at the numbers and why people voted for him, and they decided that they needed to play identity politics even more so because they already knew that it was working, and they wanted to distract people from the fact that they themselves were the big bad boogie people of global corporatism. To distract the masses from their own global corporatism, the Democrats quietly overturned the Smith-Mundt Act, thereby legalizing the usage of propaganda on the American people in 2012. And the first big thing that they more than likely hatched completely deliberately with the intention of divide and conquer identity politics trickery was the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter movement, of course, was a movement designed to supposedly save black people, presumably black men, from being killed by white police officers, but it was inspired by the Trayvon Martin slaying committed by George Zimmerman, who was neither a police officer nor white. And don't forget that the 3 women responsible for the viral hashtag were also queer, black, fourth wave intersectional feminists. Because all left-wing activism since Occupy had to be feminist, of course, maybe because Hillary Clinton was always supposed to be president in 2016. Regardless, as Black Lives Matter heated up more and more in 2013 and 2014, it became the main source of protest activism fun for the left, because the left really likes protesting as most of their parents are aging hippies, and because protesting is exciting if there's no chance that you'll ever get hurt or arrested, which was the case, of course, in the case of Black Lives Matter. Seriously, Black Lives Matter protesters were constantly shutting down roads and causing an illegal ruckus, and seemingly nobody was ever doing anything about it. The worst opposition they faced for years was the occasional person that said, "All lives matter," which Black Lives Matter supporters acted like was a stab against black people because that's just how self-righteous their activism truly was. And remember, even though this was supposed to be a movement to save black people from violence, these people were also all feminists. Because aside from Sean King, aka Talcum X, who certainly isn't any more than a one-drop rule black person, Every single one of the head organizers of Black Lives Matter is either female or LGBT or both. So it was a feminist thing that was supposedly standing to benefit mainly black males, as they are the ones most likely to be victims of violence. Gosh, this whole climate was already very weird. So you take the socio-political landscape of 2014, 2015, and 2016, and then you remember that the people who were partaking in this far leftist protest activism, who thought that they were radical rebels, were being led around by a bunch of feminists, and they were protesting mainly for racial identity politics and certainly not against global corporatism. And then you keep in mind that they went so far as to have Black Lives Matter members protest the left-leaning candidate that did talk about the evils of global corporate capitalism, who was Bernie Sanders. Well, you keep all of that in mind, it was already a shit show before the primaries were over, and people were already speculating that George Soros was paying for a lot of this. Finally, Clinton loses, and within a few months, we have Antifa making a major presence in various major US cities. When prior to Clinton losing the election, had you heard of Antifa? I'm fairly sure I hadn't, and I actually know personally a few members. And of course, they are all Black Lives Matter supporting intersectional feminists. It's the same exact crowd. Finally, once more, people are linking this Antifa stuff to George Soros money. And why wouldn't they? These are the same tactics that busted up the Occupy protest. The same identitarian oppression Olympics, intersectional feminist antics that misplaces rage at the system towards rage at non-specified white men as a demographic. And once again, might I remind you that Donald Trump is a nationalist, and while I don't think he's exactly a nice guy, I didn't vote for him, and I'm very worried about how he'll handle his presidency. Still, he was exhibiting less crookedness than the alternative, Hillary Clinton, at least during the campaign and probably now, and he did cancel the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we know that Hillary Clinton, for certain, is a big bank global corporatist who has done basically everything wrong that Antifa thinks that they are protesting, if they are truly anarchists, which largely they aren't, regardless. Sure, many of these Antifa people are probably just protesting for protest's sake. Many of them would protest basically any transcontinental big government meeting, and many of them don't have the foggiest idea what the word fascist even means. And more than that, many of them have been flat out lied to about people having links to white supremacist organizations, where none can be found. However, I think it's all very interesting the way these massive protests against global corporatism all started in 1999 while coming from the left during a Democratic administration, and back then the cops wasted absolutely zero time trying to squash them with force, and the media did their best to lie about what was happening as long as they could. But now, 17 years later, the protesters are protesting a global summit inhabited by people who are largely nationalists, seemingly because they are not getting the exact version of globalism that somebody thought that they wanted. And now, the police are largely standing down, and the leftist media like the Young Turks are downplaying the violence coming from the protesters, and blaming it on police. Is this not kind of rather odd to anybody else? If you wanted to believe the rumors that Soros really is paying people to organize, radicalize, and maybe even just lend their bodies to be part of the cavalry at such riots, it definitely does look like maybe there is a billionaire who's bitter and throwing a tantrum because people didn't vote for the candidate that he threw millions of dollars at. In fact, it would legitimately appear that George Soros might just be throwing an irrational hissy fit, because ultimately, I can't figure out his motivation, as this game doesn't end well for anybody if the violence keeps escalating while being brushed under the rug by big media. Unless to call people like Moldy Locks a victim. So at this point, if the Soros stuff is true, I simply have to question whether or not the guy is just fucking senile, and nobody around him has the balls to tell the goddamned, demented, mad king that it's over, that he's lost, and that he should just retire from global manipulation with some dignity and maybe take up a hobby. Because, of course, as Aiden Paladin said so well in her video, do these Antifa protesters even have the foggiest idea what they want? And since it seems like they don't, I have to pose the obvious question. Could that possibly have to do with the fact that their probable leader doesn't know what he wants? That's all I have to say for this video. Be like these people and keep me ranting with the hopeful computer upgrade that I want to get soon, and stay tuned.